Today's session, Sezaman, Contemporaneity, Tikar in the expanded field, will be joined by Dr. Simon soon. Simon. He is the senior lecturer in art history in the visual arts program at the University of Malaya, who in this talk will situate the work of Yee I-Lann within the contemporary arts context of Malaysia, focusing more on the textile of Tikar. He is currently a member of the advisory board of Southeast of Now, Directions in Contemporary and Modern Art in Asia, and also a team member of the Malaysia Design Archive. In his spare time, he actually does a lot of photography. He also runs a personal website to blog about his interests and research. We'll leave that link in the chat box. It's a very beautiful website. I think everyone should check it out. Lastly, if you have any questions throughout this talk, again, we welcome them. Please leave them in the chat box and they may be addressed at the end during a Q&A session. And so without further ado, I would like to turn the time over to Simon. Thanks, Simon.
Hi, thanks, Bruce. Thank you for the very warm and generous welcome. I'm going to share my screen so that we can begin. Hang on. There, should work now. Okay, so I'll try to speak louder as well. So Assalamualaikum and Selamat Sejahtera to everyone. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Orang-Orang Asli, Asal, and Lao, who are the traditional custodians of country and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respect to their Ambo, past and present, while acknowledging the Orang-Orang Asli, Asal, and Lao joining us here today. I would also like to thank the organizers for all your hard work in putting this series of talks together, and especially Bruce for helping me put together today's event. And also a big thank you to Yee I-Lann, whose work I continue to follow with great passion and interest, who always insists that the foundation of the net informs the many different exchanges that we have had, sometimes personal, other times joyous, at times heated, but always intelligent and generous. And this has defined our friendship over the past 10 years. The mat as a foundation is really the quintessence of meeting and exchange of things. And through obtaining these things, I am also introduced to new ideas that have reshaped my sense of who I am and my place in the world. So in this sense, when Bruce contacted me some months back and asked if I could speak more broadly about Yee I-Lann's practice in the context of Malaysian art, this has caused me some degree of worry, only because I don't really know what is the best way to help frame or understand this practice. And I fear I was required to do a lot of work but I think in my presentation today, I'm going to try to discuss the collaboration between I-Lann and the mat weavers from two communities, namely the Dusun Murid people over at Keningau and the Sama Bajau people in the Omadal Island in the state of Sabah. And I want to sort of like lean on this practice as a springboard to explore how we write and think about contemporary art history. To begin, I think the map here, for those of you who are not familiar or not so familiar with Southeast Asia, cultural geography, this is here to help. This map helps to set a stage for our discussion. Sabah, wait. Springboard for, oh yeah, okay. So you know, let me try and navigate. Oh, that doesn't move. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving on to the next slide. So do you think I can have my viewer, the slide, do you think I can have the slide, the sidebar on? Then it's easier for me to.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry about this. I'm just not very familiar with that. do this without the sidebar. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Okay.
All right, sorry. Okay. All right, sorry about that. So let's start with the first part. So the first section, it will be divided into 4 sections, and I'll try to explore them, the themes and issues as we go along. Okay, so in thinking about the weave, I want to first highlight a map to give you an idea and to help set the stage for our discussion. For those of you who might not be familiar, Sabah is located in the northern part of the island of Borneo. It is situated in northwest to Sulawesi and southwest of the southern island of the Philippines called Mindanao, which you can see here. So Caningao, as you can see from the plus and X marker, is further inland in the state of Sabah. It's not only significant as a place that is the home of a state-funded craft programs, as Yee-Lann has described in many of the interviews. It was also, of course, historically significant as the site of where the oath stone was installed, also known as the Batu Sumpah. And this was a stone that marked a historical compact. And it was a type of stone that was historically erected whenever 2 communities in conflict were able to achieve some kind of peace accord. Often adjacent to the oath stones, a tamu would emerge. And this is a type of trading marketplace held at regular intervals that would come to signify good relations and mutual prosperity through the exchange of goods between warring factions that have now made up, right? And this would be a central concept that Yee-Lann would dwell on in her practice together with the weavers. Yet, if we were to telescope out a bit further, you would have noticed that in the archipelago of Southeast Asia, bodies of waters are not simply negative spaces, they are highways and passages of mobility. It is therefore not surprising that there are many different people in this part of the world who have elected to make this very space of transition their home. And this map will give you an idea that the Sama Bajau are in fact one community centered around the Sulu zone, while there are also many other different sea nomadic people living in different parts of Southeast Asia. Of importance to our discussion today is the marker Z here, indicating where Pulau or the Pomada Island is located. This is where the Sama Bajau community who Yee-Lann collaborates with are based. The other markers, the Z marker in pink points to one of the 2 other Sama Bajau communities that I just want to mention, just to give you a sense of how decentralized the community is. Bangi is in the state of Sabah, while the other pink marker is indicating Tawi-Tawi. It's an island that falls under the national boundary of the Philippines. Now, these are islands where land settled. Previously, nomadic Sama Bajau Bilao communities have chosen to sort of settle on land in coastal areas, and these are some of the areas that they chose to settle in. And finally, there's the SS marker in blue. This is Jolo, or the island of Jolo, and the center of a historically important sultanate that became in the 18th and 19th century the central economic and distributive nerve center of the Sulu zone. And by Sulu zone, this is a term that was used by James Francis Warren to describe a vast domain that stretch across territories that are now part of 3 distinct neighboring nation states. And before the age of nation states, however, during the early modern period, 18th and 19th century, great changes were happening in this part of the world as it became sucked into the trade vortex and became a rather significant economic zone connected to the global trade network, where European country traders sought out from this region inland jungle and sea produce in exchange for manufactured wares and textiles and weapons and all manners of luxury goods brought over from India and England. So, and these produce were then subsequently sold to the Chinese market, where bird's nest, shark fins, sea cucumber were in huge demand. So this economic zone really encompassed the, spans the area that you see on the map here. And the zone provides, I think, a social cultural context for the inter-societal relationships that operated within this state-like entity called the Sulu Sultanate, right? Where political links and trade pacts were formed between riverine cultivators to upland tribes, to hunters and gatherers, to nomadic boat peoples, all forming subject groups that perform the act of procurement or roles for this, of procurement, procuring valuable goods for the Sulu traders export with China and the West. So this network of interpersonal relationship was something that was fluid, but at the same time, the power base remained diffuse, right, over a large territory. So power and status very much was based on a person's control over personal dependence, either retainers or slaves that he could mobilize. The actual power itself flows upwards through the changing networks of alliances, while the titles which conferred authority became symbols of power that reach downwards ritually and integrate even distant hitmen within the domain of the state, except for the Sama Bajau people, who were considered, I think, a bit of an outsider. In fact, some will even, it's almost like it's a pariah, sort of like within the framework of the Sulu Sultanate. Sama Bajau Laut were especially distinguished from this larger, population by their boat dwelling and nomadic habit. So they are scattered in small little flotillas throughout the archipelago, where if they engage with the Sulu state, it was primarily as a client group that offered the service of procuring sea cucumber, right? So in fact, they were pejoratively called lua'an, which means something like that which was spat out by the land-dwelling Tausug, and even other Bajau who have decided to settle on land. And so this is the kind of like ethnic makeup and in some ways the tension and the dynamics that define demographic, different inter-ethnic sort of like interaction within the sort of Sulu zone. And in this larger story of trade, I think it is very difficult at first to figure out what to make of the woven mat. After all, mats have a utilitarian function. They are mentioned in some historical accounts, yet to find historical examples of the mat hasn't always been an easy process. Now, on this point, I would like to highlight the work of one of my students. Her name is Yusra Zulkifli, who have made significant headway in trying to inventorize and compile some of the mats that have eventually entered Western museum collections. So visual patterns were the first point of entry for her to dig up some of these collections, because what is the correct terminology that you would key into the search box in order to retrieve this, the artifacts, right? And it took a lot of prospecting for her to figure out what the lexicon, to build up this lexicon of terms. Because if you were to simply put Bajau Laut mats or Tepo, chances are you will come back with nothing. So these examples that you see on the screen likely date to the late 20th century based on the acquisition year. It suggests remarkable similarity in which certain weaving patterns and techniques have endured at least a few decades. However, to gain a fuller picture of what might have been different in the collection, Yusra really sort of like, try to stretch this inventory as far back into time as possible. And it is only possible through the slow sifting and the serendipitous discovery that that's slowly a gradual picture begins to emerge, giving us a sense of how this tradition has held out for at least 100 years. So in her preliminary research, she has pointed out 3 enduring patterns: the zigzag column framed by a kind of diamond-shaped checkered bands on both sides, the multicolored alternating bands forming a neat column down the spine of the textile of the mat, and the checkered diamond-shaped motif that you see down here. Now, if we were to compare them to the Samabajau mats that are sold by Karya Neka, a government-linked enterprise set up to promote Malaysian craft today, it's very easy to identify how remarkably similar they are in terms of the shared visual vocabulary. And in considering how these mats from 1900 continues to remain remarkably vibrant in spite of some discoloration that you can see, it seems to suggest that the use of synthetic dye was almost like a practice that could have been adopted as early as the dawn of the 20th century. So the material basis of the woven mat for both the Samabajau and the Dusun community in many ways is one and the same. It begins with treated leaves from the pandanus mat. So pandanus grow wild and unattended in the shores and sandy beaches of the coastal areas in the Sulu archipelago. So a map of this area in the Philippines was captured in the publication of titled Philippine Mats in 1913. It will give you an idea of its widespread availability, even if today it is, of course, the diminishing mangrove swarms are increasingly threatened. So this will give you an indication that in the case of like the littoral areas in Sabah, it would be something that could be also found, widely found. So the techniques for preparing the pandanus sleeve and weaving the mat are roughly sort of like similar throughout the Sulu area. And in 1962, an American Peace Corps volunteer by the name of David Santon managed to record this process. Since it's one of the earlier process, I'm going to share that with you just so that you have an idea of the technique in which the mat is constructed. So first, the thick pandan leaves are cut and the center are removed. The two halves are separated and then rolled in a coil about 1 foot in diameter, tied and held at the bottom of a pot by a rock. The coil is cooked by the boiling water, removing some of the color. The coil is then dried in the sun, opened, and the leaves flattened with stick. They are drawn through a small metal bladed tool, which cut each leaf into 4 or 5 narrow strips. Edge strips are discarded and then they are bundled loosely and left to bleach further in the sun before being re-soaked in cold water for about 12 hours. By that time, they have been sun-dried and softened with the stick once again. The natural color has almost completely faded and the dyeing can begin. In this case, by the 60s, dyeing refers to the chemical dyes that are used in order to produce this exuberant, vibrant colors, right? So the colors used are green, orange, red, violet, blue, often very clashing colors. and gives the Bajau mats its very sort of like unique, aesthetic. So yeah, all these all these are rather sort of like labor intensive work, and the preparation normally takes about a week or two, while the weaving takes longer, usually lasting from 2 to 5 weeks, depending on the size, right? And and in terms of sort of like motifs, I think, as discussed, very often it takes the form of the stripes, multicolored square, or checkered pattern of white and other colors, and quite a distinct sort of like zigzag pattern that you've seen before. So among the semi-nomadic Sama Bajau, this exuberance of color used, as well as the high spontaneous geometric and other stylized symbols, set it apart from mats produced by their other neighboring communities, right? The recurrent motifs that surface in the Bajau mats are in the form of stylized crab design, a series of wave-like or boat forms, patterns created by moving water, and some other marine life forms. And these bold colors in turn exploit the principles of flashing color, where colors on the opposite end of this color wheel work to heighten the dazzling intensity of this two-color field that is put next to each other. So when Tawi weaver by the name of Gainap Nokarim was asked about the visual references that inform the patterns of her weaving, she simply answered, if I see something, if I look at something, this is all I know how to design. So it is not uncommon, therefore, when beholding the mat, one is reminded of the undulating ebbs and flow of waves, or of the shimmering luminosity of sunlight reflecting on the surface of water. Yet for all the formal complexity and its century-long engagement with abstraction and its deep implication in the story of modernity itself that I have hopefully given you a taste of, rather than merely an object, it's often viewed as an object that is customary, unchanging, that is inherited and passed down within the community, rather than an object that has underwent significant changes. And it would be very challenging to find, I think, a place for it in the history of modern art, whether it is in the diagrammatic timeline created in 1936 by Alfred J. Farr Jr., who was in his day heading the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or even the kind of network graph produced by Leah Dickerman for her revisionist account of the history of abstract art as modern art in a more recent show, Inventing Abstraction, 1910 to 1925, also for the Museum of Modern Art. Now, abstraction for the Bajau mat only makes sense and found home, unfortunately, in the ethnographic collection of Western museums, written off in the metadata description as sleeping mats, right? Yet, I think it is during the sleep that sometimes a spirit appears in a dream and asks for an offering. When this happens, the Sama Bajau performs the Sinu Manggit, feeding the dead. Food is spread on the mat, and with smoking incense, the officiating intercessor falls upon the spirit who demanded for the food. After the spirit has consumed the spiritual essence of the food, then the gathered community family members would pick on the material leftovers, so to speak. So the mat, therefore, in a way, structures a kind of social lived environment. And I think it is best clarified if we compare it to a different kind of race support platform And the collaborative work of I-Lann, created in 2020, Tikar/Malaysia, helps to sort of like bring this into greater focus and clarity. In her discussion, I think what she's saying is very interesting is that the Tikar and Malaysia might seem like very different kinds of support, different kinds of like platform to hold things, but in I-Lann's estimation, they're not mutually exclusive. But in terms of how and not mutually, they're not discusses is not in mutually exclusive terms, but in terms of how they gain meaning in relation to one another and how they define space. So in Tikar Meja, against each vividly colored tikar, the four-legged meja, or the table, registers its presence as silhouette in a weave that pulsates in bright flashing colors. Often we take at face value that the tikar and meja as furniture that gather people around came from two mutually exclusive cultural systems, the former indigenous, while the latter is colonial. I think when it comes to Tikar Meja, I-Lann uses contemporary art to question some of these very entrenched assumptions, right? Here, the Tikar is hung vertically like a painting so that the image of the table appears upright to the viewer. The original function of Tikar as a horizontal spread in this sense is suspended on the other hand. So, but on the other hand, if the table appears at all, it can only exist as a specter against the shimmering all over color field of the Tikar that overwhelms it, right? So the Tikar Meja, in a sense, realized in collaboration with the Bajau Sama di Laut weavers from Komodo Island, speaks of some kind desires to, in many ways, complicate our understanding of history as in binary terms. So while conventional ethnography imagines non-textual cultures like Bajau Sama to be untainted or untouched by historical change, I think more recent studies have shown that 18th century Sulu Sea was really a significant zone of contact within a global history of piracy, slave raiding, colonial trade capitalism. So the Meja comes in as a symbol of this fraught history, but the collaborative weave, Tikar acknowledges that the weaving process is a community effort to which the Sama Bajau di Laut confront their colonial history, and by inviting us, the viewer, onto the mat as a means of negotiating the past on their own terms. And what might these terms be, therefore? So the writing of this art history has, I think, interestingly taken the form of the Tikar ribbon, right? Woven by Kak Rosia, Kak Sana, and Kak Kinihong, and Kak Odil. It is a 63-meter long tikar, and it's stretched across the water between the local Bajau community, whose kampong is on Komodo Island proper, to the Bajau Sama di Laut water village. And this segment of the community is far more nomadic, and as a result of that, they also lack a national identity, rendering them in our common parlance what we call stateless, right? But I think I-Lann is very against the use of this term, so and I use that term very cautiously, and also in brackets, so to speak. So in the video accompanying this work, you see the weavers themselves gradually unfurl the Tikar ribbon, connecting the two kampongs, crossing the border between, from citizenship to that of statelessness. And in the process of linking, I think the Tikar ribbon becomes a very interesting kind of encyclopedic resource of visual patterns that in some ways it speaks of a kind of shared knowledge. And this shared knowledge offers us a different way to think of how the visual can be deployed as a form of knowledge. It really sort of shows as an alternative to the Sekolah Gambar or the picture school, which is an old terminology in Malay used to describe the museum. I would like to suggest that underlying all these terms of engagement and in trying to clarify what is happening here in relation to Malaysian art, there's an underlying sort of like structure in understanding that maybe in trying to clarify how the mat operates as a medium, or what the art historian Rosalind Krauss calls like the technical support of the work, the mat as a medium, how it, in trying to understand the mat as a medium, I think we can also better understand how it is actually an artwork that participates in modern art, in the modern art discourse as a work that is modernist in nature, and through which I think the mat then can gain artistic currency in today's contemporary art world. Okay, so let's move on to the next part, the permission to think. Here, I like to propose that we could read along and therefore subvert the logic of Rosalind Krauss's Sculpture in the Expanded Field, a very seminal essay that she wrote in 1979, where she suggests that modern sculpture really came into being in the early 20th century, and throughout its 50 years of existence as a discourse, as a way to frame a particular type of artistic production, it came to define itself in relation to what it is not, right? And so what it is not is that sculpture wasn't a landscape, nor was it architecture. So if previously the sculptural traditions of Europe came from the traditions of creating and building monuments, therefore, in trying to define a modern sculpture, many artists define it against the monument as operating as a negative condition of the monument. And therefore, it also defined in opposite to the collective, to the site responsive, to memory work of society, in order to carve out an autonomous space for it to explore certain aesthetic, for it to sort of like, for modernist sculptors to explore certain aesthetic issues that they want to explore through the medium. So this enterprise very much exhausted itself by the 1950s. You know, it hit a dead end, so to speak. It was simply something that couldn't go on anymore because I think there was only so much you can do within the parameters that it has built around what it considers as modern sculpture. So in this sense, at that point, you know, sculpture is something that operated within a condition of pure negativity, not landscape, and it is also not architecture. So these criteria serve to express the limits of this modernist sculpture. However, by the end of the 1960s, the outer limits of these terms of exclusion came to the attention of sculptors. And to help account for this expanded field, Krauss then turned to the Klein group as type of diagram used as a mathematical expression that you see here on the screen, often applied as a form of structuralist mapping operation within the human sciences. And by means of this logical expansion, a set of binaries is transformed and multiplied into a quaternary field, which both mirrors the original opposition of the not landscape, not architecture. So it opens up and to account for its opposite. So not landscape is directly connected to landscape, architecture is directly connected to non-architecture. So another way of saying this is that even though sculpture may be reduced to, in terms of its significance in this expanded field, there is no reason not to, I think it really opens up a space for artists to think in more complex terms. And when you think in more complex terms, one is also admitting into the realm of art, two terms that had previously, two terms that had previously been prohibited from, this category of art itself. So if sculpture were to be defined solely as not landscape and not architecture, then it was also not landscape and not architecture. That's all it could ever be. But when the complexity is sort of like introduced, I think what happens is that the term helped to sort of like really open up the space for rethinking of the limits of a particular culture's art discourse. So if a culture has not been able to think in the complex, it is because the sort of like parameters has precluded this sort of like thinking. But one of the defining features of modern art is that the thinking around form has also undergone a bit of a change, right? It's undergone significant change, and it sort of opens us up to the possibilities of engaging with different forms. So when the Klein group diagram is being used, it therefore allows us to see, the expansion of a field of visual expression is not always an arbitrary free expression based on the belief that all value systems are not subjective and therefore we can express ourselves in any way we want. Rather, it insists that there could be a structure behind the decisions that inform the kinds of innovation and the changes to form that is being introduced to a particular object of art or to a particular category of object of art. And I want to sort of like think of this. I thought this is a particularly useful way to think of the mat, but rather than try to fit the mat into the schema spelled out by Krauss, I think we need to turn to the mat as an expanded field itself and map out its trajectory, a medium that is perhaps opening itself up to possible transformation over the course of the 20th century. So to begin, the Tikar's most basic expression can be expressed by the negative terms that it is not land and not sea, since it is a type of surface that invests the space that it is placed in with significant cultural meaning. So from this, we're then able to build up the expansionary schema into a quaternary form. In instances where the ampersand makes an appearance in I-Lann's work, it often serves as a reminder in the collaboration that I-Lann has initiated, serving as a particle of binding where the imagined community of Sabah enjoins the hinterland and the coastal people to set aside their differences and to prospect the creative commonwealth as a generative ecosystem. So in doing so, I think that we could say that the land and sea are significant qualifiers to think and terms to think about this expanded field. And in that way, I've laid out the determining sort of like terms as not land, not sea, which is the Tikar. And then from there, you sort of expand it out. So not sea becomes the sea, the not land becomes the land. And I propose that when the Tikar as a utilitarian space defining object loses its exclusivity and exists as one term within an expanded structured field where the mat gains different possibilities, this permission to think has resulted in the opening up of the mat to interact with 3 other cultural domains, each with its own conceptually rich sort of like system of thought. So directly opposite the mat is, of course, the tamu. So this is the tanah dan air. So the N I was referring to is that sort of like binding particle. So And when we look at the Tikar as it opens out, directly opposite it is the tamu, and it is a type of, it is a space of meeting, to put it simply. I-Lann has this to say, and I like to quote her here, tamu means a meeting place. The hill people, river people, jungle people, plains people, and sea people will meet here at this place, this tamu. The reason they meet is because they want what they don't have. In other words, the intrinsic fundamental point of meeting is to meet the exchange that happens, rice for salt, salt for rice, and so on, shows that you meet precisely because one needs what one doesn't have. One needs diversity, one needs the other person who is not from one's community. And I think the paintings of the Tuaran Tamu by a pioneering Sabahan artist, Tina Rima, really, it's a very nice reminder from art history that offers a glimpse into the vibrancy of a Tamu market as an intersecting traffic of people and produce built on a foundation of goodwill. So it is a place of trade. It occupies, you know, it serves as that important sort of junction between land and sea as a space of bridging. So in this way, I think the tamu is an expression of the possibility that sits at the junction of both land and sea. So on the right side of the tamu then is the patch, right? Here I am thinking of how texts are activated as calls of solidarity. In many ways, as I was looking at this collection of work, they remind me very much of the sewn patches, the ones that you find not only on the uniforms of Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, but also on the torn jeans of a punk rocker or his bag, right? A satchel bag. So those familiar with I-Lann's practice would know that the punk music scene of Kuala Lumpur was a significant cultural presence during her formative years in trying, as she was struggling and learning how to become an artist in Kuala Lumpur during the 1990s. So the patch here speaks in codes of solidarity, you know, and I think it possesses a strong affinity with some of the anarchistic principles of the seafaring Baja, who chose to forego nama or the name or the title that had great, you know, material, social, and cultural purchase within the Sulu Sultanate, you know, social system, in favor of being free at sea, dilaut, right, at sea. So the patch are in many ways like sails. So while the Bajau sails are today made of any available material, in the historical construction of the lepa, the sails were in fact mats of plaited pandanus leaves and often displayed a variety of colorful designs as well. So as sails, I think they, and also as mats and as patches, they are social banners in the way that they help to, you know, they are, you know, they offer a line of flight for those people who want an escape from the long imperial arms of the state. An opposite side to the patch is, I think, the karaoke, right? In another context, I refer to the art historian Patrick Flores, who described the karaoke or the sing-along as a kind of like calibration of intimacy through suffering, through which a kind of post-colonial sensibility emerges from. So he pointed to transvestite beauty pageants in the Philippines and highlighted the work of anthropologist Nell's ethnographic analysis, whereby contestants sings, you know, musical numbers like Autumn Leaves with so much gusto and sentimentality that when it becomes strange that the loss that it signified, when, especially when it is linked to a very seasonal imagery of autumn that apparently made no immediate sense in the tropics. And for many of these, the transvestite population participated in the beauty pageant contest, they would not have had the chance to sort of like travel overseas. But in this instance, Canal suggests that even so, the idea of loss itself does, and it speaks across these geographical and cultural divide. In singing the song, part of whose meaning escapes one evokes, among other losses, the sadness at not having completely understood, at being excluded in relation to a cultural register, which, if one masters it, can open doors of possibility and change one's life. So patchwork and karaoke, I think, completes the expanded field through which I think when we look at, the sentimental lyrics of Adele's Hello, which apparently gained popularity. When we look at a song like this, it not only gained popularity, but also gained new meaning. And these liquid meanings are by turn very much sincere, powerful, humorous, campy, sentimental, forceful, and tender. I think it is best understood in relation to its visual counterpart that is, I imagine to be the Tikar emoji, which offers us another take and clarifying how the lyrics to a global pop hit as a text on the mat is really also another way of depicting the surface of that shimmering texture that accompanies, 10,000 wants and desires, then that make up the different patterns of the Bajau, summer Bajau mat. So for me, whenever I'm trying to understand contemporary art as an art historian, I think the hardest part is the exercise of trying to historicize. Oh, sorry, this is the karaoke, and these are the mats. I forgot to do my slides. So the hardest part for me is the exercise of trying to historicize any given practice. Now, I could have deferred easily to the indigenous knowledge system and worldview and build up a history from that vantage, or maybe sway towards the global and the exhibitionary discourse in order to help frame Yee I-Lann's practice. But I was given the task of, talking about it through the lens of the national, and this has been quite challenging. But I think given that one of the things that really sustained our friendship, my friendship with Yee I-Lann, over the many years, rested on the grounds of the fact that we share the same nationality. This is where I think we might be remiss if we do not address what new ways of thinking about art or national art history that the mat can offer us and can contribute to our thinking of Malaysian art history. And as it turns out, I think it offers a remarkable breakthrough in terms of what I'm able to see in the archive itself. So some of the earliest attempts at putting together a survey of Malaysian art were expressed through exhibitions like such as the 1971 Reza Piadasa's show that he put together for the National Cultural Congress. It was historically significant, and in another instance, seldom acknowledged, but a visibly present timeline found in the catalog of the exhibition Towards a Mystical Reality that Reza Piadasa and Sulaiman Esa staged in 1974. So in locating and naming the exhibitions of found objects as part of a movement called mystical conceptualism, Piadasa as artist and in his 1971 role as curator turned to art history for answers, to answer contemporary concerns that he was troubled with and trying to work through what might knowledge and aesthetics about the arts, how can he understand knowledge and aesthetics about the arts in the context of a Malaysia that was trying to find its own aesthetic and cultural direction. Yet, as you can probably tell from the timeline, the historiographic approach is very conservative. It's a succession of stylistic movements and pioneers marked by temporal rhythm, marking the temporal rhythm of art history. So when you build such a timeline, it doesn't veer very much from what you've seen before when Alfred Barr Jr. Produced a chronological diagram for Cubism and abstract art. But considering that a national art gallery was established in 1958, it really wonders, one really wonders why it took so long for this desire for national art history to take root or take off. So over the course of the 60s, I think some attempts have been essayed. By and large, the National Gallery took a passive approach. And it wasn't until the race riots of 1969 that I think in trying to find a way out of the cultural gulf that have divided society, a plural society that is multiracial in character, that the National Cultural Congress was convened in 1971. One significant outcome that is particularly rich in connection to our topic is the change in leadership at the National Art Gallery. So an artist and cultural technocrat by the name of Ismail Zain was, in this instance, appointed as the leader of the director of the organization. He would later go on to found the National Film Development Corporation and held various other senior positions within the government on cultural affairs, besides also making art, and is known as a pioneer in digital art in his own right. So when appointed as the director of the National Art Gallery, I think Ismail Zain led the exhibitions committee to prepare 2 papers on the policy. And what's interesting about the paper is that, okay, you know, there wasn't a previously there wasn't a policy. In paper 1, it spelled out, of course, the standard, but important emphasis that, you know, the new direction for the National Art Gallery should be pedagogic in nature. So also, and this means engaging sort of like non-English language public and designing, of course, more educational programs alongside facilitating greater artistic exchanges, as well as taking a leading role in building up a solid collection that can be a point of reference for anyone interested in studying the history of Malaysian art. So far, so boring, right? But the second paper is where it gets interesting. So after all that, you know, the standard policy stuff, Ismail Zain then proposed that, you know, given that sculpture and painting are relatively new medium, he was really trying to advocate for a change in direction in how we sort of like think about how the way we categorize art and how then museums subsequently collect art. So in this instance, what he proposed was that, you know, given that traditional crafts was also already in many ways experiencing a kind of revival, and the visual also expands beyond painting and sculpture, he suggested that maybe we shouldn't limit ourselves to what he calls exhibition type art, easel painting or sculpture, that is relatively new to Malaysian society, you know. But instead, he advocated for the renaming of the museum, of the gallery. So rather than the old title, Balai Seni Lukis Negara, Seni Lukis meaning painterly art, which normally it has 2 meanings. So it means paintings, but it also is an umbrella term that that roughly means fine arts in general. Okay, so rather than call yourself a gallery, a national gallery, he advocated for changing of the name to Museum Seni Sezaman. So Sezaman is the interesting word that I want to highlight here, because it opens up a whole new sort of like possibility. And this possibility, I think some of it is maybe it's seldom, it's not fully expressed in the way the word Sezaman is used. And in a much reduced form, it continues to be used in the Bakat Muda Sezaman, or the Young Contemporaries. It's an art prize that was initiated by the National Art Gallery in 1974. But I think in the policy paper itself, what is interesting is that you really see how Ismail Zain understood the expanse and the possibility of what this term, what is included in this term. So I quote him here, the proposed scope should cover the following areas of this new modern, and this new sort of like museum, seni Sezaman, painting and sculpture and other practices, traditional crafts, films, feature films, advertising materials, decorative arts, modern theater, music, fashion, architecture and environmental planning, industrial design, art education program, right? So in this sense, what he was trying to sort of do is then argue that for a much more expansive sort of approach in which we might approach the visual in the context of the contemporary. Unfortunately, of course, this vision did not come to pass. I'm not sure what happened. I'm still trying to sort of like find out why it wasn't actually debated in the board. But in many ways, I think what it encapsulated was a kind of cultural energy that also forces us to rethink how we have assess and evaluate what is called the national culture policy in Malaysia. So it is a policy published sometime in 1973, 2 years after the Congress, and it summarized the discussions that were held during the Congress along 3 principles. First is that Malaysian culture that is in the making should be based on the indigenous cultures of the people in this islanded region, right? And the second point is that other cultures external to this part of the world can be accepted and transformed into a national culture if it doesn't contradict, the values and of the local culture. And the third is that Islam then is that sort of important unifier in shaping a national culture. So these principles, of course, tend to be interpreted very selectively and often in isolation from one another. And also in retrospect. So as a result, it's a reading of the policy that is quite restrictive and one that is filled with a lot of cynicism. Yet I think it is instructive to revisit, something that Ismail Zain wrote in 1976 on the problem of Malaysian culture, in that he placed great emphasis in suggesting that in no uncertain terms, the 3 principles needs to be read in relation to one another. And therefore, in the search for national culture, we shouldn't really forget the reality of our multiracial society. We should steer towards the ambition of building a nation whereby its citizenry, made up of different ethnicities and grouping, can form a lasting compact. So the interest and compact, and as a unit of of great meaning, is very often lost if we were to only view this through an exclusionary, identity-centered kind of discourse. But of course, Ismail Zain's ideas are not without its shortcomings. There's a propensity towards Catholic embrace of everything. It evokes diversity, but it can also be easily instrumentalized, such as the way he choreographed the 1991 parade, The Way Forward, Jalan Jalan ke Hadapan, a performance in 3 chapters, glorifying the nation and really marking Malaysia's march towards Mahathir's newly introduced Vision 2020, right? His campaign to turn Malaysia into a developed nation. So, of course, in the 3 chapters, we begin with the colonial period, where everything was chaotic. No one knows where no one knows what everything is. The people are not moving in sort of like unison. So everyone has their own sort of like, there are a lot of conflicting sort of like drives and aspiration. But then the 2nd chapter moves on to a night market scene. And then this shows the beginning of some kind of like search for spiritual strength amidst the chaos of modern life, ending finally with the third chapter, where you see an image of a boat that is about to set sail. So it's a scenario that invites the audience to picture the journey of reaching one's achievement. And as the ship is about to sail off, it is accompanied by a choir, and then it transforms itself into a computer graphic on the screen behind the stage, and becomes an image of a ship digitally morphing into a spaceship that prepares to launch outwards into space, before ending with a twinkling of firefly lights that reminiscent of the Kuala Selangor marshes. So this kind of spectacle is in many ways apathetic. In many ways, these type of spectacles are in many ways quite does not actually sort of like acknowledge the harsher realities that other artists are also attending to at the same time, where they're training their attention to a different type of social world and existence that equally have a stake and claim to modernity, especially when they live under the shadows of all these modernist towers that were being built upwards as symbols of progress, expanding, and alongside these towers are the expanding squatter areas, and they spread outwards around Kuala Lumpur and accommodated those who are often left out of the story of modernity that we want to tell. But in the case of Namala Dut, she found in photography a durational power to map out the temporal dimensions of change and inertia affecting the disenfranchised. So modern art, growing out of the permissibility afforded by policy to rethink the local, I think can have certain can emerge beyond the design of state cultural planning. Artists were also at an individual level beginning to interpret what the NCP could mean on their own terms, and starting to acknowledge those who they share space with and would want to build a community together with as well. So in coming to the end of the presentation, I'm currently reading this rather wonderful book called On Sulu Sea, written by a sociologist from New Delhi who married into a Penang family, and the husband was a doctor who that transferred to Sabah. He was a doctor who was then transferred to Sabah, and it was here that she, I think she was a housewife, so she befriended the Bajau community, and in wanting to continue on with her education, she did her fieldwork on the Bajau community in Sandakan. But in the process of studying the Bajau, the book turned on the author herself, and it became more of the author's autobiography, or a kind of autoethnography about her failing marriage, and that she reflected then in hindsight. In many ways, the research was a means for her to find her own, to stand on her own two feet and secure her own independence outside of the life of marriage that was broken by then. So these stories, I think, contribute to the stories of how definitions and terminologies have been transformed, of solidarities being established, of hopes being renewed, of the local being made global, and the periphery being recentered. Now, these are very big and facetious claims that one can make, and therefore we might approach a map of the global with Borneo at its heart, designed by I-Lann I don't know how to approach this, but I see this with great amusement. And having known I-Lann, I could not help but be tickled by this goddamn sense of self-righteousness that is expressed through the sloganeering that you see here, right, in the text. Because, but at the same time, I'm really touched by it because it is not simply angry. It carries with it so much tenderness. And this is what I have learned, therefore, in the slow process of learning from other centers, one learns not to regard these as borderlands of margins to which another but self-same country can be constituted. I'm also reminded and humbled by the gulf that those from seeming edges must cross to register a visible presence in the supposed center, even if this was the nation of the artwork. Sometimes in registering one's presence, it must be crafted out of anger and indignation, but I-Lann seems to point to another possibility that this indignation is not always a retreat. It can be expressed through a language of art that carries with it the emotional weight of the world, condensed as pop song lyrics, as emojis that surf and glitter across the surface of the ocean in order for you to find your own community. So on the Sulu Sea, it almost as if you built your family through being bigger than what your detractors thought of you and being more imaginative. And I wonder if these are lessons that we can draw on in order to rethink and rewrite our art history. And finally, I want to end with this lovely work that is really my favorite, titled Mansal Ansal. It's a tikar made by in collaboration with the weavers of Keningau, very much a visualization of the indeterminacy of where one is heading and what one is thinking about, that the title suggests, Mansal Ansal, meaning to walk and walk without knowing where you are headed, to be lost in order to find one's way. In a way, that must be the attitude, I guess, that we should cultivate in order to write a different kind of art history, not as timeline, not as a genealogy, but as the flickering sunlight on the surface of a seabed, laps of wave, bands of colors. I think these are wonderful images of thoughts to use Deleuze's concept, right? These are important and wonderful images of thoughts that offers very rich lines of light for writing our history that is our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that presentation. Before I have some questions on my own, and there are a few questions in the chat box I saw. I want to remind everyone in the audiences to leave behind any questions that you have. We have just about 15 minutes left, so we'll try to answer them over the course of the 15 minutes, but please leave them here. This is quite a special occasion for us. First of all, I loved the 4 sectionings that you did, Simon. I love that you started with the weave. This respect for the medium that you have, that all the richness from the work actually stems from the materiality. So talking about that and talking about the lexicon, the relationship to waves and water, and I mean just how the way you linked those motifs throughout the presentation has been very poetic, actually, very poetic for me to experience. And I particularly love the diagrams that you pulled up too, the contrasting diagrams that are related to genealogies, lineages, but also expanding beyond that. We have one question from the Q&A, which is about the diagrams that you've cited, particularly sculpture in the expanded field by Krauss. So, I mean, the question really is simply what your cited source is, and to answer that person's question, the essay is called Sculpture in the Expanded Field. But riding off of that, Simon, maybe you could speak to us a little bit about your choice in referencing this diagram, maybe reiterating first your choice of that over the choice of, say, Barr's diagram of the cubism.
Right.
The cubism.
Sure. I think there is an interest to also be playful on a visual level, given that the square-like diagram is in many ways, to my mind, at least connected to the form of the mat, right? And I was looking at the mat as a kind of like space that could sort of hold ideas and concepts and different sort of like aesthetic concepts. Then this immediately sort of like came to mind, and of course, anyone who has done art history will know that this is one of the canonical texts that you will probably have read or encountered during your undergraduate years, given the prominence and of the October School as a group that have pretty much defined how we read and engage with modern art. So I wanted to see if there's a way that we can borrow some of it, the more playful way in which they have produced very interesting explanatory grids to account for the emergence of art over the course of the 20th century, and see if this has parallels in other parts of the world, and if so, then what might it's not only what might it look like, or it's not only a case of enriching our understanding of modern art, but really, if they exist, then what are its implications as well? How does it then really change the way we understand modern art as a field?
Mm-hmm. To me, what's special, I actually tried to draw that while you were talking. I tried to draw out the diagram.
Okay.
Sorry?
You tried to draw a diagram? Okay.
Yeah. I just, I tried to, without looking at your screen, draw the diagram as well. What's interesting to me about that diagram over, say, like Barr's diagram again, is that, as you briefly mentioned, it's a method of, it's centered around excluding. It's what's not. What is a Tikar not? It's a surface that is not land and not sea. I want to know that, you had this diagram, this model. How did you pick the parameters around them? How did you pick the four corners?
So as suggested just now, and it wasn't clear because I forgot to sort of click next. I think the parameter of not land and not sea, if you have seen the previous slides, it was structured differently, right? Or slightly differently. But how I ended up with this is by trying to think through Yee-Lann's practice and her investment in the ampersand as that sort of like binding glue between Tanah dan Air, or land and sea. I thought that was significant enough as a sort of like conceptual framework to think alongside with, so that in trying to, set out the first parameter, which is to define which is to create the negative condition of what the Tikar is, then it seems very obvious that the Tikar is not a sea. It's not the seabed. It's not the sea surface of the sea, right? It's not bodies of water, and it is also not land, and hence that's why you have the Tikar. And from there, then the process is one of replication and expansion, right? From not land, the opposite side won't necessarily have to be land, and then not sea, it's definitely sea on the other end. And once you have this dynamic sort of like mapped out, I guess the rest of it is more poetic. It's based on what I find interesting in Yee-Lann's work, as well as some of the recurrent and prevailing themes that she has constantly highlighted in our conversation, in her discussion about the work, as well as in how it's being actualized in the collaboration.
I sense that there is a gravitation towards what is negative, not in a pessimistic negative, but the negative of what is sometimes neglected or overlooked, like the sea. We're focusing on the land so much, we're not seeing the sea. And it's on that note, it's actually interesting for me to listen to your presentation, that you choose to focus on the C community, the Sama Bajau community, where in Yee-Lann's work, there's also a significant collaboration with the Kaningao communities. What was that choice like for you? I want to hear a little bit about that.
It's entirely personal in the sense that I guess I am more familiar with Sama Bajau culture, and history principally because I'm also supervising amazing work that my student is doing, and also another student who is working on some Bajau weaponry. So as a result, I have to often do a lot of catch up, and therefore I'm way more familiar with Sama Bajau culture and history compared to the Dusun Mulut culture and histories. And this is entirely personal. I did try to smuggle the Dusun Mulut woven mat back into conversation at the end with the Ansal Mansal, but you're right in pointing that there is an imbalance, and hopefully over the next few months I'll get to sort of like strike I'll be able to sort of like balance it out better.
No, I did not mean to point it out as something that's missing, but that it just seemed to somehow actually reflect what you were talking about. This idea of you mentioned that the Sama Bajau community is often considered the outsiders. This sense of the margins. I get that sense. So I just wanted to ask if that was part of your choice. We have a question in the chat box again. I will read this out word by word, I think. Okay. So this one says, to my knowledge, first of all, thanks for your presentation, Simon. To my knowledge, there have been attempts to include traditional crafts like batik, which is also associated with textiles, into Malaysian modern national art discourse. So why does batik make it into modern art discourse, but Tikar weaving remains within craft? What are the cultural, political assumptions that might also inform the aesthetic reasons for this? In other words, for example, proximity of batik to painting. That's interesting.
Right. So I think in a sense, I wonder if Tikar weaving has remained as craft, given that our friend Yee I-Lann has successfully helped to midwife or facilitate this transition. But I think I don't know if I'm going to answer, if I'm addressing your question, but my sense is that when batik is accepted as part of a Malaysian modern national art discourse, batik underwent a transformation where it became a particular format or a particular medium called batik painting. It was no longer a textile art or a textile craft form. It became an art form, and this format was called batik painting. So that is the limits of, I think, in the modern art discourse that you've described, that I think someone like Ismail Zain was trying to deconstruct and pull apart in favor of a concept of contemporary art that is Sezaman, that would include also traditional craft without requiring the traditional craft to undergo some kind of transformation into a modern art or contemporary art form for it to make sense within the context of a discussion.
Thank you for that. Well, actually, if audiences get to come to chat to see the show, I think our display methods of Yee-Lann's both the batik work but also the Tikar works respond to that. We're also over here very much thinking about that relationship. So on that note, I want to invite everyone over again. And Simon, thank you for the presentation. We are just about running out of time, but I know all of our audiences. I'm receiving messages from our team as well. We found your presentation to be so poetic in a way, but also so grounded in the materiality. So thanks very much for your time. And I feel like I just listened to something very. I feel like this is very innovative. The diagram to me is very revealing. It's a very new way to think about the Tikar for me.